Richard Trenton Chase, infamously known as the Vampire of Sacramento, earned this gruesome nickname due to a series of horrific crimes that involved the use of human blood, not only drinking it, but also collecting it in containers and even smearing it across his own body as part of deeply disturbing rituals. Born on May 23, 1950, in Sacramento, California, Richard Trenton Chase grew up in an environment marred by instability and violence. From an early age, he was raised in a household where emotional and physical abuse were a regular part of daily life. His father, described as authoritarian and aggressive, was known for frequently beating both his wife and children, instilling fear rather than love within the family unit. As Chase entered his teenage years, he began to exhibit signs of severe psychological disturbances that alarmed those around him. Teachers and classmates noticed that he was an extremely withdrawn and quiet young man, often isolated and behaving in strange, unpredictable ways. Various reports indicate that Chase displayed the traits associated with the McDonald triad, a set of behavioral patterns thought to be early indicators of potential psychopathy. These included persistent bedwetting well into childhood, a disturbing tendency to harm animals, and an unhealthy fascination with fire. By the time he reached his 20s, Chase's mental condition had rapidly deteriorated. He began experiencing intense delusional thoughts, firmly believing that his skull bones were shifting and that his blood was drying up inside his body. He developed the paranoid conviction that someone was attempting to poison him, fueling a spiral into deeper psychosis. In a desperate attempt to replenish his blood and sustain what he believed was a failing body, Chase began killing small animals, cutting them open, and drinking their blood. He rationalized this behavior with the belief that the animal blood would somehow revitalize his system and prevent him from dying. Eventually, his increasingly erratic behavior led to his admittance to a psychiatric hospital, where his obsession with blood became so prominent that fellow patients mockingly nicknamed him Dracula. Despite these alarming signs, after only a few months of treatment, medical professionals declared him stable enough to be released back into society, a decision that, in hindsight, would prove to have devastating consequences. The first known victim of Richard Trenton Chase's murderous spree was Ambrose Griffin, a 51-year-old engineer and the father of two children. On that day, Ambrose had simply been helping his wife unload groceries in front of their home when, without warning, he was shot and killed by Chase in an act of senseless violence. Chase then fled the scene and managed to avoid immediate detection or arrest. At first, police believed the incident to be the result of a random drive-by shooting, a type of crime that was not uncommon in that particular neighborhood at the time. However, what the authorities failed to realize was that this was no isolated event, but rather the beginning of a brutal and chaotic rampage, an early sign of a deeply unhinged man who was about to fully embrace his darkest, most sadistic obsessions. At that time, Richard Trenton Chase, suffering from severe mental illness and delusional beliefs that his body was dying due to a lack of blood and that his internal organs were rotting, wandered through a quiet suburban neighborhood carrying a .22 caliber pistol, a kitchen knife, and an empty yogurt cup he had prepared specifically for a ritualistic blood-drinking session, until he eventually came upon the home of a young married couple where the wife, 22-year-old Teresa Wallin, who was 3 months pregnant, had just stepped back inside after taking out the trash, completely unaware of the danger lurking nearby, and as she re-entered her home through the front door, which had been left unlocked, a detail Chase interpreted as an invitation to enter, he confronted her and, without any warning, shot her at extremely close range in the chest, causing her to collapse onto the floor with grave injuries while still barely alive, then shot her twice more, once in the head and once in the hand, which she had instinctively raised in an attempt to protect herself, before dragging her body into the bedroom, removing her lower clothing, stabbing and slicing open her abdomen with the knife, extracting some of her internal organs, and proceeding to drink her blood directly from the wounds, even using the empty yogurt cup to collect and consume more blood, as if sipping from a glass, then smearing the blood across his own face and body as part of a disturbing, delusional ritual he believed would heal him and keep him alive, and after completing his horrific act, he defecated on the kitchen floor, left bloody footprints and handprints on walls and surfaces, and opened several cabinets as though searching for other containers in which to store blood or organs, before finally leaving the house without taking a single valuable item and calmly returning to his apartment, leaving behind the mutilated and blood-soaked body of Teresa Wallin, which was discovered hours later by her husband, David Wallin, who returned home from work only to be met with a nightmarish scene that would shake the entire community. A house drenched in blood and the brutalized body of his wife, which in turn triggered an intense and far-reaching investigation by Sacramento law enforcement. On the morning of January 27, 1978, Richard Trenton Chase broke into the home of 38-year-old Evelyn Miroth after finding the front door unlocked, a detail he always interpreted as permission to enter. And upon stepping inside, he immediately shot and killed Dan Meredith, a family friend who happened to be in the hallway, before proceeding to the bathroom where Evelyn was bathing her 22-month-old nephew, David Ferreira, shooting her without hesitation, and then dragging her lifeless body into the bedroom, where he removed her lower garments, mutilated her abdomen with a knife, extracted some of her internal organs, and drank her blood directly from the wounds in a disturbing continuation of his delusional belief that consuming human blood would restore his own deteriorating body, after which he turned to the helpless infant David, stabbing him repeatedly, decapitating him, and taking parts of his body with him upon leaving. Evelyn's 6-year-old son Jason Miroth, who had witnessed the horror and tried to flee, whom Chase shot in the head at close range, completing the blood-soaked massacre of an entire family in what would become the most gruesome and heartbreaking act. A crucial breakthrough in the investigation came when one of Richard Chase's old acquaintances, a woman who had known him since his teenage years, contacted the Sacramento police to report her deep concerns and suspicions after hearing about the recent murders, explaining that Chase had been acting increasingly erratic, obsessively talking about blood, frequently killing and skinning small animals which he often kept in his apartment, exhibiting disturbing behavior that included blending raw organs with soft drinks, showing her a .22 caliber pistol, the same type used in the murders, and even making cryptic comments about how people were trying to poison him and how he needed blood to survive, all of which led her to believe that he might be involved in the brutal crimes that had shocked the entire community. On January 28, 1978, just one day after the horrific Miroth family murders, police officers surrounded Richard Trenton Chase's apartment in the Watt Avenue area, carefully monitoring the scene and waiting for the right moment. And when Chase finally stepped outside carrying a large brown paper bag stained with what appeared to be fresh blood, officers immediately moved in, tackled him to the ground, and placed him under arrest without resistance, marking the end of his month-long killing spree and the beginning of one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in California history. Following his arrest and psychological evaluation, Richard Trenton Chase was brought to trial in 1979 on 6 counts of first-degree murder, where his defense team argued that he was legally insane and suffering from severe paranoid schizophrenia that rendered him incapable of distinguishing right from wrong. But the prosecution countered with strong evidence of premeditation, such as his methodical selection of victims, use of weapons, attempt to conceal evidence, and deliberate avoidance of witnesses, leading the jury to reject the insanity plea and ultimately, on May 8, 1979, find him guilty on all charges and sentence him to death by gas chamber at San Quentin State Prison. Though before the execution could take place, Chase, who had grown increasingly withdrawn and delusional in solitary confinement, managed to hoard his daily doses of prescribed antipsychotic medication, and on December 26, 1980, committed suicide in his prison cell by overdosing, thus ending the life of one of America's most disturbing and mentally unwell serial killers, remembered forever as the Vampire of Sacramento.